I can hear me. All right, so thanks for coming out to this talk. I'm going to try and go through this in 25 minutes and keep us on track. So I'm going to really skip who I am. You can read about it in the little brochure thing if you really want to. But long story short, I'm a security intelligence engineer for a company called Lookout, and that is a fancy way of saying that I'm a malware analyst. So today we're going to talk about a few things. We're going to go over quickly what adware really is. I'm sure most of you have heard that term before or possibly experienced it yourself. We're going to look at a case study from one particular family that was pretty interesting. And then we're going to talk about why we should even care about adware. I mean, it's usually pretty boring, right? We're going to look at some interesting technical details about this case study, and then we're going to talk about the aftermath of this particular family and the future of the adware industry. So, adware. Like I said, I'm sure most of you have heard this term before, but in case you haven't, I'm sorry, I'm going to burst your bubble now and bring you over to the dark side of the internet. Well, I mean, not that dark, but it's not fun to deal with. It's basically software that bombards you with disruptive or intrusive advertisements on your device. So, you know, it's not necessarily often the height of sophistication for malware. It's normally financially motivated and often really poorly built, not typically obfuscated as well. Sometimes it gets kind of interesting because you'll have certain malware family or adware families that will actually collect sensitive information about your device or about who you are. And that's typically in a way to kind of try and improve the advertisements you're being served. And an interesting report from Lookout in 2013 demonstrated that 6.5% of all free apps contained adware. So, good times. All right, so let's look at this case study. It started like most great stories do with a Zendesk ticket. And a user contacted us and said that they were seeing out-of-app ads on their device. And they were able to look at the Android multitasking window and see that these ads were coming from something called beta plugin. And that's all we knew. But what we were able to find out through, the good old Googleverse is that there was exactly one mention of beta plugin, and it was in this Android forum that dated back to 2018. And essentially, all of these people in the forum were complaining about the same problem. They were seeing out-of-app ads, their phones were becoming almost unusable, battery life was in the toilet, and they were listing all of the apps that they had recently downloaded that they thought were the culprits. So the interesting thing about all of these apps was that they were from the same developer, and they also contained thousands of reviews that were outlining the same kind of adware functionality. And basically what they were outlining was a flagrant disregard for Google's ad policies. And so I've put the ad policies there, but you probably understand already from using a device yourself what those could be. Essentially, don't do anything to mess up my device, don't show me ads when I'm not using an application, and, be a good guy. So with some investigation that I will spare you all of the details for, because we've only got 25 minutes, beta plugin, which you can see a screenshot of my test phone right there, ended up being a really well-obfuscated advertising plugin that was hidden within a whole bunch of different apps. So at the end of the investigation, it turned out there were 238 unique applications on Google Play, and the plugin was loaded as a DEX file via a loading class called Chihu360. I'm probably saying it wrong, but that company is actually considered the largest Chinese cybersecurity company, and they make an AV software. So, didn't detect their own stuff, apparently. What's interesting is the loaded plugin is never actually installed to the device. So if you were to look through the packages on your device, you wouldn't actually see beta plugin or anything like that. You'd only see the kind of like dropper application that was responsible for loading it. And the features that it brought to your device were battery depletion, lock screen advertisements like this great tax cycle ad, advertisements that actually prevented you from operating the device as you normally would. So people reported that they would get a phone call, they'd go to answer the phone call, and they'd get like a full screen 30-second video ad, and they'd miss their phone call. So, that's not operating as it should. And then advertisements with accompanying sound. This actually happened on my red phone. I had the phone sitting on my desk at work, and then I just heard like ghost music from somewhere and realized it was an app or an ad on my phone that was playing music while my phone was asleep. So that would be embarrassing in certain situations. So 238 applications with two things in common: beta plugin and developed by the company Kutek. So this is where the story gets kind of interesting, because Qtech is actually a publicly traded company on the New York Stock Exchange. They were founded in 2008 in Shanghai. They now have an office in San Francisco. They were awarded one of the top 10 most innovative companies in China by Fast Company. They were awarded one of Google Play's best apps of 2015, and they IPO'd in 2018. So as of June 2019, they say that their global products reached an average of 255.5 million monthly users around the world. Some of you have probably seen this app before. This is their flagship app. It's called TouchPal. It's basically a keyboard that you can skin to make look really cool. I don't know. And they also have a bunch of other apps, fitness apps, like water trackers, step trackers, all that kind of fun stuff. A lot of the apps they've published are actually developed by Qtech, but are published under different names of other companies that aren't really other companies. So that's kind of fun. And at the end of the investigation, all of the cumulative downloads for the 238 applications totaled 500 million users. So a lot of people were hit with this. So let's talk about why we should even care. I mean, if you work in malware, everyone kind of jokes about adware being the crappy apps that you have to deal with. They're typically overloaded with packages that don't really do anything. They're really poorly built. They're clunky. They're kind of garbage. So, if all the apps are doing is really generating fake ad revenue for some company you've never heard of, who cares? So this is where it gets interesting. In this particular case, these advertisements were so aggressive that people were having to do factory resets of their devices. And again, I mean, no one's dying, presumably, but it's not something you want to have to deal with. Maybe you lost your kid's dance recital when you did that factory reset. It's not so much fun. The other thing that you have to think about when you're talking about aggressive advertising plugins is what kind of ads are actually being served to the device. So there have been reports recently of certain ads that are, serving pornographic images or phishing sites or click to download or click to play ads. And that's where things get a little dicey, because then you're not just dealing with, kind of harmless advertisements that are annoying, but they're also potentially compromising your device further. And then, as I said, there are those ads or ad plugins that collect sensitive information and exfiltrate it to kind of bring you the best ads they can. Great people. The other reason why I think it's important to care about adware is because it targets everyone. It is most likely the type of malware that you will be targeted by, because it doesn't discriminate. It's not looking for political dissidents or activists. It's just sending out a huge net and trying to grab as many devices as it can. An interesting report from Checkpoint in 2019, they have the state of the malware report. They basically list all of the most popular threats they've seen. They list adware as the most common malware affecting both consumers and businesses year over year. So, everybody's seeing it. And to a lesser extent, unless you have a company, maybe you don't care about this as much, but if you have an ad company that's paying for clicks or views that are not actually getting clicked or viewed, then that company is being affected. Okay, so let's look at some fun technical details. Can everyone still hear me okay? I feel like I'm cutting in and out. Good? Okay, thanks. Thank you. How did this particular family of apps get past Google Bouncer? So what was interesting about this, and what made it particularly difficult to figure out if this actual functionality was happening, is that they wouldn't actually trigger any malicious functionality. The actual plugin wouldn't get triggered until after a specific amount of time. So they had a time delay. They had conditional checks in place to basically check whether the device was an emulator, whether USB debugging or ADB was enabled, even whether the device was using auto time or auto time zones, basically trying to find any way that they might be essentially being viewed by a researcher. And they had a bunch of anti-debug measures too. So if you stepped through the actual loading of the plugin in a debugger, everything would crash every single time. The only real success I had was installing the application on a Red phone, which is like a test device, and just waiting. And like I said, thankfully I got that ghost music and I knew that this was the app responsible. So another interesting thing they tried to do was hide the executable. So you can see right here, there's this icon icomoon-gemini.renc file. That is the actual executable file that is the beta plugin. In early versions back in early 2018, they just named it beta.rec, and the plugin wasn't encrypted or anything like that. In later versions, they renamed it to this icon icomoon thing, and they actually encrypted the plugin with AES. So in both cases, it's actually an executable file, it's a DEX file. But what's interesting is that icomoon apparently is an application that gives designers and developers icons and vectors for use in building applications. And there's even one pack called Gemini. So presumably they were trying to make this look like it's just fonts or vectors for a particular app's assets, because it was located in the assets directory. So now we're going to look at, did I skip something? No, good. So now we're going to look at kind of the most interesting class or package within this particular family. It's aptly named Hades SDK, and this is the collection of classes, the package that's basically responsible for loading the plugin and kind of leads you to figuring out how the plugin is actually loaded to the device. So what's interesting about the Hades SDK is that it is containing the AES encryption key, but it does this through a series of connected methods, and then you can see this get encrypted key function there. I'll spare you the really boring details of stepping through all those functions because it required a lot of coffee and maybe a glass of wine. And so what was interesting about this class is that not only was it actually loaded under or located under com.android.utils, not trying to hide at all, but it's actually responsible for retrieving the asset path where the plugin's located, configuring the plugin to be loaded with other plugin frameworks or like the Chihu loader, and then pretty much all of the interaction between the plugin and additional ad libraries once it's loaded. So it was doing a lot of stuff. It performs checks for whether the plugin's been decrypted, whether it's loaded, specifies the output source for jar files that were generated, and then sets alarms to trigger ad-related intents, and even specifies the spaces where those ads are going to appear, like this one that says lock screen function, and then get space. That's just basically saying we're going to show it on the lock screen. Now, another interesting way that this was kind of hidden is that you couldn't necessarily see how Hades was being initialized from the outset. You kind of had to step through a whole bunch of functions. So there was a class that was a subclass defined in the manifest called com.scanner.qrc application that you can kind of hopefully see up there. And we've got a little video. You see that? Cool. That shows how if you go to QRC application and you kind of step back through all of the onCreate methods, you realize it actually lives, or it's actually calling methods from Hades once again. And then if you go within Hades and you click through, then it's probably hard to see, but basically that's the Chihu plugin loader right there. So you had to step through a whole bunch of different methods essentially to figure out that QRC application is actually just loading Hades stuff. Okay, so once again, we talked about how there were earlier versions that had kind of different naming techniques for this plugin, but there were also different versions that had kind of, I guess, classes that weren't really as obfuscated. So what was fun was that the earliest versions had hard-coded strings, not obfuscated, not encrypted at all. You could see exactly what the class was doing. And then later in the icomoon sort of variation of the plugin, all the strings were XOR encrypted and then base64 encoded using this open source third-party library called StringFog. You too can get it on GitHub. And every single class that facilitates anything to do with loading the plugin had its own separate key. So the Hades package, all of the classes in there were decrypted using this Robin High string up there. Okay. So, I mean, that's a very quick overview of some of the more interesting ways that they tried to hide a lot of the functionality here, or at least see that this plugin was being loaded from the particular applications we were analyzing. But what actually happened? So we reported all of these apps to Google, and we published our research in June 2019. And then Qtex stock dropped 20% in like a day. that was fun. You never really want to get DMs. Yeah, you don't really want to get DMs from their PR people on Twitter. That's never fun. The plugin, some of the plugin was removed from different applications. There were like 40 or 50 where they took out the plugin, and then there were some where they just re-uploaded new versions with the same plugin. And in some versions, they actually, in their own words, refactored the code and said that it wasn't the exact same plugin, which it wasn't. It was just, the same code. But it continued to violate Google Play policies. So we, again, discussed this with Google, and Google temporarily removed all of the apps that Kutek developed and then actually banned them from the advertising platform. And then their stock dropped 40% from the original value. So, yeah, basically a good lesson to be good guys. So I really like this quote. It's from a researcher at Checkpoint in a Wired article that I think is worth reading. It's, you can't see it, but you'll get these slides after. And he says, you're starting to see actors realizing that just regular adware won't do these days. If you want the big money, you need to invest in infrastructure and research and development. And so that's what we're seeing. I mean, adware, it's a shifting industry. This is not an isolated incident for 2019. Earlier in April, there was a company called Do Global. They had about 100 apps in the Play Store that accounted for about 600 million installs. And they were removed from Google Play for violating ad policies. And this ended up, at that point, this was the biggest ban that Google Play had kind of brought upon major developers. And again, we're seeing a considerable increase in the level of obfuscation, I was trying to merge the two words, and sophistication. There are a few examples here just from 2019 alone. Preamo is a particular adware family that connects to not one, but 3 different ad frameworks using 3 different methods and implementing specific delays and checks to avoid detection through things like Google Bouncer that are, essentially sandbox tests for malicious activity. ForShared is a file storage app, and they used invisible overlays to submit fraudulent clicks and views. So, that's kind of genius, right? Bad, but genius. Agent Smith is another one from this year, I believe in the summer. And it started actually in 2018 as a really clunky and just kind of crappy piece of adware. But then they refactored it, like all great software developers do. And they improved their code base and their functionality. And so instead of just serving ads, they would actually have the applications search through the user's device, find all third-party installed applications, and reinstall those with a more, ad-heavy framework. And that would be their way to kind of improve the revenue that they were gaining. And so aside from these, and kind of all adware in general, in the last year at least, we're seeing more actors relying on legitimate infrastructure and basically approaching adware not as some kind of crappy app that you're building, but more like a full-fledged software development project. And what's interesting about the use of legitimate infrastructure is that it makes it more difficult to determine whether network traffic is actually legitimate. So what does this mean for the future? Basically, increased obfuscation means there's less low-hanging fruit for adware out there in official Play stores or elsewhere, and it makes it more challenging to convict. Because it used to be that you would see adware, and you could figure out what it was doing right away, and then you can kind of tick it off your list and move on to something a little bit more sophisticated. But now that we're seeing all of these new ways that developers and these big companies are actually obfuscating their code bases, this is not going to be as easy. We're also going to continue to see the introduction of ad plugins and this functionality that, really toes the line of breaking official store policies, or just like full-on jumps over the line. And then these larger, reputable companies, we see them investing R&D dollars to produce more sophisticated and novel approaches for basically avoiding AV detection or avoiding the detection of particular, AV situations like Google Play is, and generating that fraudulent advertising revenue. And this is something that, actually a journalist mentioned that they often receive kind of like whistleblower emails from developers who are either competitors of larger companies or work for larger companies who are saying, these guys are trying to break the rules and they're getting away with it because they're big and they have the money to invest in kind of a more sophisticated code base. So that is all I have And if you have any questions, I am more than happy to answer them if we have time. Cool. A million degrees.
Hey, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for the talk. It was very interesting, as always.
Thanks.
2 questions. What tools do you use to analyze any of the samples that come your way? And the second question is, are you seeing a lot of code reuse among the base, which makes it easier to identify? Or do these developers just sort of, from start to finish, come up with their own code, which makes your job harder?
That's a good question. So the tools that we use, the biggest one that you're seeing screenshots from is a piece of software called Jeb, and it's specifically for reversing Android applications. It's great. It's pricey. I think a license is like $2,000. I know that the NSA tool Hydra is apparently going to be implementing some functionality for doing Android reversing as well. So that's a good free option. And that's kind of the main one, other than some Python scripts to automate like pouring through different files within the APK package. And then in terms of code reuse, so within this particular family, there was tons of it, but I don't really see that much between different adware families. This was made a lot easier by the fact that I could look at earlier versions that weren't obfuscated that well and see where they kind of iterated and improved on their code base, and then where they did actually encrypt the strings. But yeah, most of what I've seen is there's not really that much reuse between different adware families. Thanks. So for this, it was only Android. There wasn't an iOS component. Cool. Thank you. I'll be around too if you want to come talk to me and ask questions in person.